Our exploration of pinups brings us into the 21st century. Over the roughly 60 years covered in the last episode, Western culture started to shift its ideals when it came to women and modesty, among other things. Burlesque shows became one of the first examples of openly using sex appeal to sell products. The definition of femininity changed thanks to the competing ethics of elegant Gibson girls and first-wave feminism. The world was speeding up. The term pinup is still nowhere near fruition, but the early ingredients are visible. In this episode, we'll examine and discuss how important events might have catalyzed a sudden shift in the social standards for women. This historic video series is brought to you by the Historic Autographs Company. You can find trading cards and relics related to the history explored here on our website. Link in the description. Our 1918 product has a chance to pull pinup cards depicting and containing authentic period clothing worn by our own models, as well as autographs relating to 1918, DNA hair cards, and more. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content. Episode 2: Edwardian and the Age of Flappers. The first decade of the 1900s is referred to as the Edwardian Period in England, known as such because it coincides with the rule of King Edward VII. It was a fantastic time to be wealthy, right at the tail end of the Gilded Age, when the rich lived luxurious lives in palatial countryside mansions built on the misery of the working class. The period is often depicted and romanticized by various media as the last ember of the lords and ladies aesthetic in the West, when grace and beauty had yet to morph into glitz and glam. This is further reinforced by it being the last period named after the reigning monarch. Nowadays, the Edwardian period is often looked over, considering it's one relatively uneventful decade sandwiched between the height of the Gilded Age and World War I, but there's a few notable elements that we can pick out in our examination. Women's Edwardian fashion was slightly more plain compared to the Victorian era, yet still using multi-layered shapes around the shoulders and hips and patterned cloth. Side by side, it's immediately obvious that Edwardian fashion gets suddenly slimmer compared to the decades and decades of voluminous court dresses. Edwardian dresses also emphasize the bust and glutes in a way that other eras of dress did not, partially because, for several decades prior, thin waists were in fashion and big dresses made the waist look thinner. This change can be traced directly back to the Gibson girl. There was a trendy new look involving an S-shaped corset that, instead of heavily restricting the waist and breathing of the girl wearing it, forced her to stick out her glutes and bust in a way that gave her side profile an S-shape. Evelyn Nesbit and other models drawn by Gibson were likely participating in the trend, and thus the Gibson girl popularized the look. Women's fashion trends had practically always been about flaunting a woman's figure based on what was popular at the time, but the emphasis on the bust and glutes was new, and noticeably more form-fitting and less conservative than before. American theater, and as of 1895, film, also flourished in the Edwardian era. The American burlesque shows mentioned in the last episode were staying family-friendly for now, but that doesn't mean the entire industry was. A constant lightning rod for love and hate alike came in the form of actresses like Theda Bara, a silent film star famous for playing seductive roles like in Cleopatra. Her film career wouldn't start until 1914, but when it did, she ignited a controversy about how far film was allowed to go with raunchy costumes. While fashion and film set new trends, American women were trying to set the next. The aforementioned first wave of feminism saw a rise in popularity as the suffragette movement picked up steam. Women were engaging in protest, with varying degrees of intensity and success, to gain civil and financial freedoms with a focus on gaining the right to vote encoded at the federal level. Culturally, socially, and financially, women suddenly gained more mobility during World War I when they filled jobs that were vacated as the men became soldiers. They eventually won the right to vote in 1920, but we're not there yet. In 1914, social movements, fashion trends, and pretty much everything else took a back seat to the Great War. You probably know the story already. Gavrilo Princip murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and all hell broke loose. Allies and Central Powers figured out very quickly that old battle tactics don't work against 500 rounds per minute. America joined the war late in 1917 when the Zimmermann Note was decoded and uncovered a supposed German plot to keep America out of the war by sponsoring a conflict between the US and Mexico. The US joins the war, and American troops are launched in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive in 1918. 47 days of brutal trench fighting later, an armistice is declared. 47 days doesn't sound like a lot compared to 4 years, but it was nearly 7 weeks of one of the bloodiest battles in US military history. 1.2 million relatively inexperienced US soldiers sent to fight against mustard gas and machine guns. Over 26,000 US casualties. American soldiers were fresh compared to the French forces, British forces, Belgian forces, and so on that had been fighting for years, but anyone in that situation would have trouble keeping it together. So soldiers often took with them keepsakes from home to remind them of what they're fighting for. One of the most common, easy to transport, light, slim, flexible, were photos. These weren't pinups. Not yet. Not as we know them now. Not in the sense of a specific art style flaunting feminine charm published in magazines. These were just pictures of families, and sometimes sweethearts back home, and sometimes famous women, and sometimes racy ones. People would remember what those keepsakes did when the next war rolled around, but for now, what was more important than what soldiers brought with them to the Great War is what they brought back. And no, I'm not talking about Spanish flu. 1.2 million American troops went to Europe, and 1.2 million Americans, born and raised in a political climate steeped in isolationism, experienced European culture and lived in it for multiple months, between pre-advance movement and training and post-war occupation and leave. The many different cultures soldiers experienced across Europe had different ideas about modesty and women in general, some more alien than others. For example, take Miss Fernande, a European model who regularly posed in the nude or near nude and sold a lot of pictures. For American cinema and stage, risque performance was a tool for shock and awe, one which sparked constant debate, but in Europe, comparatively speaking, it was more normalized. Soldiers brought these ideas home, which left an impression on them and their peers. There's no way to fully grasp the cultural impact caused by the First World War, especially not in a 10-minute YouTube essay, but for our cases, looking specifically at the precursors to the pinup art style and the ideas that led corporations to advertising and selling sex appeal, European elements like Miss Fernande might have been an important catalyst added to the pile of shell shock and generational divide that would set this decade apart from any prior, and it might help explain flappers. Perhaps it was spurred by European ideas about modesty. Perhaps it was spurred by jazz, or the limitless prosperity of the post-war economy, or women finally being allowed to vote, or the existential dread caused by watching half the kids your age disappear overseas and return only for the other half to die of influenza. It could be dozens upon dozens of reasons, but no matter what reason, flappers were new. Flappers were emblematic to the Roaring Twenties. The word flapper was a slang term for a trendy young woman who went to speakeasies and parties and generally shunned the traditionalist feelings of the older generations. They wore short skirts and pearls and bobbed hair, and they stayed up late. Their clothing was nothing short of culture shock for the older high society ideals of Victorian and Edwardian fashion. Underclothes in Victorian times were 3 layers, covered ankles and sleeves. Parents across America scoffed as women went out to enjoy the night in dresses that, by comparison, might as well have been bath towels. Needless to say, it was a sharp turn. So let's review. Edwardian fashion demonstrated how feminine beauty standards were more about the bust than before, while the film industry breaks new ground. Then the Great War rages, and a generation of young soldiers carries pictures of back home to remind them of what they're fighting for. With new perspective, the next generation comes out of the post-war period into the glamour of the 20s with a nationwide eye for indulgence. Women were publicly showing more skin than ever, and over the next decade, fashion continued to shrink, going sleeveless and sometimes even shoulderless. Burlesque abandoned its family-friendly nature and became more striptease than anything else. There'd be another major shift in direction coming in the 1930s that would put a damper on the partying. But that's for another video. That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Tune in for the next episode as we continue to explore the history of pinups. And don't forget to check out the website to peruse Historic Autographs products.